I'm very pleased to welcome Professor ex-Councillor Baroness Julie Smith, a lady of many titles. And now let's see if I can get it right. I have been told how to say it, given a quick Dutch lesson by Gordon, and I think it's Gijs de Vries, who no doubt will correct me when he comes on. I'm Councillor Louise Bloom. I'm Deputy Chair of SLF, and I've been an SLF member since the beginning and a party member for an extremely long time. I'm currently a councillor in South Gloucestershire. Before that, I was a cabinet member for environment and sustainability in Eastleigh, and going back before that, I was on the GLA in the early days. So been in the party a long time and well aware that defence is one of those tricky issues in the party. Whenever I've been interviewed to be a council candidate and also to be an approved candidate, and they ask the question, what is there any party policy you disagree with? Apart from that brief period after the 1986 conference, for those of you who remember it, go back that long, I have been a unilateralist and always was and still am. So it's a lot of division in the party, always has been again, lot of interest around this subject. And at the moment, with what's going on in Ukraine, it is certainly once again, I think, at the forefront of people's minds. So just to now give them each a little bit more of an introduction. Julie Smith, well known to most of us, I'm sure, is a Professor of European Politics in the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University. She was a Cambridge City Councillor between 2003 and 2015, was made a life peer in 2014 and is currently the House of Lords spokesperson on defence. And then Gijs de Vries, is that right or vaguely right?
very nearly right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is another one of our colleagues from our sister party D66 in the Netherlands. He's a retired diplomat and currently visiting senior fellow at the European Institute of the LSE. So we have two top diplomats, international relations, politics people with us, which is excellent. Gijs is a former member of the Dutch Parliament and was the European Union's first counter-terrorism coordinator between 2004 and 2007. So I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion for the next sort of 40 minutes, 50 minutes or so. There will be time for questions at the end, but please do put them in the Q&A rather than the chat, because the chat gets very busy and questions can get lost in there. So if you put your questions in the Q&A, I will try and keep an eye on the chat, but it's a bit tricky. So let's start off. I think Julie's going first, is that right? Yes. Okay. Yes. And you are now unmuted, Julie. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, right, so lovely. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Louise, I was in many ways delighted to be invited to speak today. However, I'm slightly disappointed that I'm able to be here online, because the original idea was that I was supposed to be in Oslo for the weekend. Yes. And a sort of reunion of people who had been at the Royal College of Defence Studies in 2019. And the general view was that the cost of living crisis had become so great and the cost of living in Oslo was so great that we couldn't actually have the visit. So I got back to David Grace and said, actually, I am going to be available. So I'm here hoping to speak about Europe, security and defence. But I noted in your opening remarks, you talked about unilateralism, and I've also seen a comment pop up in the chat already about to what extent do one's views about unilateralism affect life as a councillor and so on. I would propose to talk primarily about Europe, security and defence, a little bit about where I think the Conservatives have gone with Boris Johnson first as Foreign Secretary and now as Prime Minister, and a little bit picking up on the conversation of the previous session about where the Labour Party are, because there's a difference between Europe and defence to some extent, and a very clear sense, if you're listening to the Labour Party, that they want to be mirroring what the Conservatives are saying at every point on defence, which is a slightly odd position to be in. And as the Liberal Democrat defence spokesperson, I find myself sometimes feeling I'm not being sufficiently pro-armed forces in my rhetoric, because Labour are so keen to say every time they speak on defence, and we support Her Majesty's Armed Forces, which as Liberal Democrats we do as well. However, we also need to make sure that we have policy that is appropriate for the United Kingdom. And I don't think the role of any opposition party is simply to be supporting what the government's saying. But I thought where I would go back to really is precisely the 6 years since the referendum. I don't want to talk about Lib Dem security and defence policy going back to the year dot. I hadn't been going to talk about the differences that perhaps mark out Liberals and Social Democrats still to some extent in the 21st century, but I might touch on the nuclear deterrent at some point. But in the previous session, Chris was basically saying that we haven't been given the Brexit that people were promised. So even those people who voted for Brexit can't be happy with what has been delivered. But of course, one of the areas that was underexplored at the time of the referendum was European foreign security and defence policy. All that really came up at the time of the referendum were Brexiteers complaining about the fact there was going to be a European army. And it was one of those dialogues of the deaf, essentially, where the Brexiteers would say, there is going to be a European army. And those of us advocating Remain said, but the United Kingdom has a veto. There won't be a European army unless we agree to it. And then after the referendum, when there appeared to be further moves towards defence cooperation among the EU 27, the Brexiteers said, see, we told you so. To which the response would be, yeah, but that's because we left and we couldn't veto anything anymore. But that was a rather sterile and unhelpful debate, because what I think was clear, I assume to everybody who's on this webinar, certainly to those of us who are advocating Remain, was that European foreign policy and close cooperation with our European partners in the European Union was vital to the United Kingdom, that our security interests are geographically most closely aligned with those of our nearest European neighbours. How could it be anything else? And yet, if you listen to the Brexiteers, there were some who were going back to the 18th and 19th century who appeared to think that Britannia still ruled the waves, and if she didn't, she should. So the narrative from the Brexiteers was very different, seeming to forget geography. And it was clear to many of us on the 24th of June 2016, when the vote to leave had happened, that our security interests wouldn't change as a result of Brexit, that those relationships with our closest neighbours needed to be as strong as they were before. And so one of the things that I have been arguing for, both in terms of defence but also foreign policy, is that we do need to be working very closely on a bilateral basis with some of our nearest neighbours, particularly France and the Netherlands, in terms of security and defence policy, as well, ideally, as working alongside European policy. But the view of Boris Johnson when he was Foreign Secretary and now as Prime Minister has been so very different, that for him, this was about taking the United Kingdom back east of Suez. And the Queen Elizabeth class carriers, which were derided by Vladimir Putin when they were first announced, when he said, look, they're just a sitting target. They were going to be part of the diplomatic and defence mission to take the UK back east of Suez. The rhetoric from the Lib Dems has constantly been, we didn't see the point of that. William Wallace in particular has complained bitterly over the years that this is an absolute nonsense. Why on earth do we want to go back to the 1950s? But beyond that, of course, we got AUKUS, the Australia, United Kingdom and US agreement, which was hailed right across the House of Lords when it was announced, with one small voice coming from the Liberal Democrat benches, where I said, well, is this really the best thing we could be doing? Do we really want to be antagonizing the French by having a new high-level agreement, which clearly appeared to be going behind the back of the French? And while there might be an interest for the United Kingdom to be working with our colleagues in Australia as well as the United States, doing things that appear almost inevitably going to antagonize France isn't necessarily a useful way forward. But what we get from Labour is something that says we completely agree with the government. But fast forward to the last 6 to 9 months, what we've seen very clearly with the withdrawal from Afghanistan is the extent to which the UK is almost entirely dependent on the United States in terms of our role in NATO. So however much we might have highfalutin rhetoric as the United Kingdom, in reality, when Joe Biden finalized the withdrawal, the UK simply had to follow. And I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan has demonstrated the limitations of British foreign policy. It's also very clearly highlighted some of the problems with the Home Office that link also with security questions, because so many people who should have had a right to come and live in the United Kingdom because they'd worked alongside the UK in Afghanistan have not been able to leave Afghanistan, and their lives are in peril. And that is an absolute failure of leadership from the United Kingdom. So that's one area where there is a very clear Liberal Democrat line of critique against the government. But the war in Ukraine, at one level, the Prime Minister has sought to show leadership, and our friends in the Baltics, as well as in Ukraine, have been very appreciative of both the rhetoric and the weapons that have been coming from the United Kingdom. And I think we need to show our support and say we must be working to support Ukraine. But it shouldn't be in the way that the Prime Minister is currently doing, almost just saying this is plucky little Britain standing up for Ukraine. Again, working alongside our European partners, we can probably be at least as effective, if not more effective. But the war in Ukraine highlights something that perhaps we'd written off over the years, that the idea of war in Europe seemed to be inconceivable. Now, I say that despite the fact that clearly we had war in Europe just 30 years ago in Bosnia, but the rhetoric has for so long been that both European integration and or NATO have made war impossible. And we now see that it isn't impossible. And that to me, and I think to most Liberal Democrats, means we should be working ever more closely with the European Union. But outside the European Union, we're in a difficult position, or the UK is in a difficult position. And as a member of the International Relations and Defence Committee in the House of Lords, I put this to Alan Duncan when he was a minister, because he was going on about how important it was for the Western Balkans to be part of the European Union. And I said, yes, but isn't it rather difficult for the UK government to make that case when you're taking us out of the European Union? And he told me that that was an inappropriate question to raise. I still think it was a very valid question to raise. And the fact that now the Prime Minister is so keen to be supporting Ukraine, and Ukraine is so clearly saying that they should be part of the European Union, does make you wonder whether the government actually has any clarity in its own thinking. Sorry, the British government, the Ukrainian government very clearly has clarity. And it would be rather nice to be led by somebody with the vision of Zelensky rather than the vision of Boris Johnson, if he has a vision. So I think that leaves us as Liberal Democrats in some ways being able to say, well, we were right 6 years ago in the referendum and we're still right. We should be working much more closely with our European partners and allies, and we ideally should be back in the European Union where we belong. But failing that, then I think we need to be ensuring that we keep open all forms of dialogue, both at a party level through ALDE, and obviously we're hearing Phil Bennion and others talking about that this morning. I think keeping open party dialogue is really important. And hello to Gijs, whom I first met when I was a young doctoral student, and he was a member of the European Parliament leading the Liberal group. So those relationships on a party basis are important, but also between departments, between ministries in different national capitals are important. And that's the sort of area I think we need to be working on in a foreign policy sense. In a defence sense, one of the key issues, and I'll finish on this point, that Jamie Stone and I have been pushing, but it's been the narrative that I think we are increasingly hearing from across the party, is that we need to commit to our armed forces, and that force reduction, as we're seeing it, has gone too far. Jamie is proposing to bring forward a defence spokesperson's paper to the autumn conference, should the Federal Conference Committee allow him to do so. And one of the issues that is going to be coming up and will be a subject for debate, I guess, is going to be the deterrent. But I think I'm not going to talk about that at the moment, but if other people would like to, then obviously happy to take that in Q&A. But I think I will draw to a close at that point.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Apologies for going off camera. Some of you know I've got long COVID and I just decided to have a coughing fit, so that's why I had to go off camera. I think it's a bit rude for the chair to disappear. And I know Julie told me a couple of days ago that she's not been well and was worried about sounding a bit hoarse and throaty as well, although I think you're doing fine so far, Julie, but hopefully you'll last.
It's a lot better today, thank you. I didn't quite squeak.
Very glad to hear it. Just wanted to pick up one thing Julie said before I hand over. Today is of course Armed Forces Day, yes. And you know, I am very proud to be a forces brat. When I was born, I didn't have my name on my wrist badge like babies usually have. I had DO, standing for daughter of, my father's name, and I'm in the miscellaneous section at the National Records Office as babies of diplomats and forces personnel born abroad always are. My sister and I always joke that we are officially, or used to joke, she's not with us anymore, but joke that we are officially miscellaneous. And I do think it's one thing in our party that sometimes, because we do have strong views on defence, the sort of the let's support the armed forces thing, sometimes we get accused of not doing so. Of course we now have a retired major as a new MP, so yep. Following on from of course the wonderful Paddy Ashdown. So I think it's something that will be really interesting to see if, as you say, Julie, assuming and we can't assume these things, that Jamie Stone's paper comes forward to party conference. So I think it'll be a really interesting debate that we're going to be having, because so much has changed in recent times. So now I'm very pleased to hand over to Gijs, who, as I said in the introduction, was the EU counter-terrorism lead, and for his comments on thoughts on Europe and security. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Louise, and wonderful to be with you here today, particularly in the wake of that stunning by-election victory, which has so revived everybody's hopes and spirits, and may the Lib Dems go on strongly from here. Britain needs that, and frankly, Europe needs that. So congratulations. I'm particularly honoured to be following Baroness Julie Smith. Indeed, we've kept an eye on each other's professional life for a while, and I've always been tremendously impressed by her deep commitment and by her constant adherence to the importance of the European Union as a partner of the United Kingdom. That link is, I think, essential for both sides. Let me add a few words with respect to the defense dimension. and focus a little bit in the second half of what I'm going to say on what could perhaps be done in terms of concrete steps to strengthen relations between the EU and the UK in the field of defence. But first, let's go back for a minute to 2018, when the European Council drafted its mandate for negotiations with the UK post-Brexit. That included an important sentence, and I quote, "The European Council restates the Union's determination to have as close as possible a partnership with the UK in the future. Such a partnership should cover trade and economic cooperation, as well as other areas, in particular the fight against terrorism and international crime, as well as security, defense, and foreign policy." So here was the EU reaching out to post-Brexit London to salvage security cooperation from the wreckage of the referendum. Fortunately, Theresa May responded favorably. In July 2018, the British government proposed a wide-ranging agreement with the European Union to address the external security threats. And that covered 10 areas: law enforcement, criminal justice cooperation, counter-terrorism, foreign policy, defense, development, cybersecurity, health security, civil protection, and migration. A really ambitious, positive program. And the EU was ready to engage on that basis. Of course, then history intervened, and history was called Boris Johnson, and nothing came of this defense and security dimension because Mr. Johnson withdrew his support for that part of the deal. I think that was a major geopolitical mistake. We're living in increasingly dangerous and unpredictable times. It's not just Russia, it's not just China. There's lots of mayhem brewing across North Africa, in the Middle East, and in sub-Saharan Africa. And each and every democracy will have to reach out to other democracies to defend our common values and our common interests. So the missing security link in our relationship, I think, is a serious geopolitical setback for democracies worldwide. Unfortunately, things have not improved since Brexit. In the Integrated Security Policy Review the British government issued last year, there was one sentence which mentions the EU. "We will work with the EU where our interests coincide. For example, in supporting the stability and security of our continent and in cooperating on climate action and biodiversity." In itself, an innocuous sentence, but there is a lot more to the relationship than the government was prepared to mention. We've seen good cooperation on Iran. We've seen reasonably good cooperation on Ukraine, even though that was mostly a matter of parallel decision-making in Brussels and London rather than joint strategy and joint implementation. But perhaps we should be grateful for small blessings. So where do we go from here? What can we salvage in the years to come? The EU, post-Brexit, has tried to strengthen its internal credibility on defense. It has set up a system called Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, where there are 60 projects between EU countries in the field of defense, joint projects. The European Defence Agency has been strengthened. There has been, in the new EU budget, a defence fund of 8 billion euros for the years ahead for defence cooperation. The EU is now, for the first time, investing heavily in space, both the civil and military dimensions, more than 13 billion euros. The European Investment Bank is planning to mobilize around 6 billion for dual-use projects. In terms of research, notably on the civil dimension, Horizon Europe has earmarked about 1.6 billion euros. So the EU is putting its money where its mouth is. Beyond that, there is work, finally, on a European rapid intervention force, which could help in terms of the military and civil missions the EU would like to undertake in terms of stability. Importantly, the European Peace Facility, a new element in the budget, has been used to provide 2 billion euros of military aid to Ukraine, and EU member states separately have announced plans that add up to around 200 billion extra in national defense spending in the years ahead. But before we get carried away by that long list of small steps forward, we should remember that the missing link clearly is joint procurement. EU governments still, by and large, are disinclined to jointly buy military equipment. They all prefer to subsidize their own industries. Only 11% of EU defense procurement is common procurement. So the EU still has a long way to go. Where then is the potential for the UK and the EU in this process of gradually strengthening the EU's defense capacity to link up? There are two ways forward. One would be a comprehensive security agreement based on the 2018 British proposal. That would be by far the best, because it would cover around 10 areas, and it would be the basis for a sustainable, long-term cooperative relationship. If politics does not allow for that comprehensive agreement, then perhaps the fallback position could be incremental steps in specific fields, confidence-building measures. I could imagine 5 or 6. Let me very briefly mention them without going into too much detail. One on PESCO, on joint projects. The Netherlands, Julie mentioned the Netherlands in terms of cooperation with the UK. The Netherlands is leading a project on military mobility, 1.7 billion euros, to allow our military forces to cross Europe in case of an emergency without too much difficulty. Now, Canada has linked up with the EU to do this. Norway has linked up with the EU, and the United States has also joined this project. The UK so far has not, but the door is open. Secondly, the European Defence Agency can work together with countries outside the EU. It does so with Norway, with Serbia, with Switzerland, and Ukraine. For that, you need a so-called administrative agreement. The UK could suggest such an agreement, and it would find the door open. Thirdly, the European Defence Fund, the 8 billion, Norway is an associate member. That would be a third option. On space, there could be closer cooperation in terms of exchange of classified information, such as the EU has agreed with Norway and Switzerland. And on missions and operations, there are now around 20 agreements between the European Union and other countries. And those other countries, interestingly, include 4 of the Five Eyes countries. In terms of missions and operations, the EU has operational agreements with Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. Not with the UK, because the UK so far has refused to envisage the option. But in each of these areas, perhaps small steps forward would be possible as confidence-building measures towards a more holistic relationship. But let me finish with the political difficulty of moving forward. And that can be summed up in one word: trust. There is a definite lack of trust at the moment between most EU capitals and London. And that worries me profoundly, because it's in nobody's interest. But there are reasons for that lack of trust. The EU has just launched its 3rd legal procedure against Mr. Johnson's government for non-implementation of the treaty he himself signed, the Protocol on Northern Ireland. Mr. Johnson has just proposed new legislation to de facto rescind some of the elements of that protocol altogether, as he had done already, that proposal, in 2020 in the Internal Market Bill. On each of these points, Mr. Johnson shows his signature is not worth the paper it's written on. How can we work together if we cannot work on the basis of a treaty signed is a treaty implemented? We need to trust each other. But beyond our narrow EU-UK relationship, there are wider questions about Mr. Johnson's commitment to international law. We've seen the Nationality and Borders Bill, which, according to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee, would break international humanitarian law. We've seen the Overseas Operations, Service Personnel and Veterans Bill, which in its original reading would have excluded British military officials from lawsuits, even if they would be suspected of things like torture or crimes against humanity. Fortunately, thanks to the Lords, that part was taken out of that British government proposal. But we see a number of these proposals that are obviously designed to appeal to a nationalistic, fairly xenophobic part of the English electorate. Banging up on foreign commitments and on international law seems to be a popular pastime. That does not create a basis for trust. So I very much hope that the Lib Dems will continue their fight to keep the United Kingdom to its international obligations, because the more trusted the UK is, the stronger it will be as an international partner, and the more effective global Britain can become. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's I think to a lot of us, most of us in this party who are internationalists, Europeans, the fact that basically at the moment we are viewed as totally untrustworthy is extremely concerning, and something to be a bit ashamed of, frankly. So now we're going to move over to questions, and David Grace is just saying thank you, a magisterial summary. I praise. I think I've got to read them out rather than we're going to bring people in, but the first question is from Jeff Payne, who would like to know if Trump or DeSantis become the next president of the USA, God help us, how should we prepare for the USA withdrawing from NATO, which I think they've both suggested at different times. Do you want to go first on that one, Julie?
Not really. I think the experience of 4 years of Trump wasn't one of withdrawal from NATO. And while a lot of his rhetoric was extremely hubristic, in some ways, banging the table and trying to persuade certain NATO members to contribute more financially to defense wasn't necessarily a bad thing. So another Trump administration, given that he would have a maximum of 4 years, so we're already factoring in then something of a lame duck. I'm not sure that that would be the end of NATO. And I don't know enough about other candidates to know whether it's realistic to think they would pull out of NATO. So my sense with Trump is it would not be an easy ride for 4 years, but I'm not sure that he would necessarily walk away. And when it came down to it, on many foreign policy issues, he appeared to take a degree of advice from the grown-ups in the room. But obviously that was then, and the future might look very different. He could say, why are we continuing these fights? But I think while Russia is in Ukraine, the situation could be such that he says we need to stay part of NATO. The question is whether he is as closely linked to Russia and Putin as he is sometimes alleged to be. Because if he is, then NATO isn't going to be able to act effectively. And the key thing for us is to be as closely linked with our European partners as possible.
Yeah, yes, thank you. And Chris, have you ever come across Mr. Trump in your, or Mr. DeSantis indeed, in your international travels? Hang on, we just need to wait a sec for you to be unmuted by the person who's running the desk. Can we have, I don't think I can do it. Oh, there you are, great. Okay, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for allowing my voice back on. I agree very much with Julie. Oddly and counterintuitively, Trump has actually increased America's military commitment to NATO during his term in office, including through restationing of troops to countries that he thought were politically of interest to him, such as Poland and the Baltics. Politically, I think his presidency was an unmitigated disaster in terms of international law and international peace and stability. And I think were he to return, or one of his clones, we had all invite our guardian angels back on duty. Having said that, there are a couple of things we need to do regardless of who ends up being the next president of the United States. One area that needs work is our strategic dependence as Western European democracies on certain critical minerals, raw minerals. Our strategic dependence on certain imports of agricultural products. There are some real vulnerabilities that, regardless of who ends up in the White House, the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe will have to address. And my plea would be for us to start thinking of ways of doing that together. And I very much hope that either the House of Lords or the House of Commons could give off some signals in that respect, because I think that would be really, really useful. It would sort of open up an area of discussion where it is in our blinding self-interest to work together, and where there may not be these political obstacles that I alluded to earlier. Talking about raw materials is unlikely to create headlines in the Daily Telegraph. So that might be safe for Mr. Johnson to entertain, and meanwhile we can lay a basis for the future. I'm trying not to be too cynical here. But I do think we need to think about these questions of strategic dependence, regardless of the agenda elsewhere in the world.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I have another question. Let me just get it back up again. Hang on, this came in the chat. If you can try and put questions in the Q&A, it's easier in terms of filtering them out from everything else. So this, actually I've got two questions. Oh no, it's one question, I beg your pardon. Right, see what I mean? Let me just, hang on. Right, so how should the UK and the EU deal with the challenges of China? And are there any lessons to be learned from what's going on in Ukraine at the moment on that score? So Julie, shall I come back to you first?
Yes, okay. Can I go back slightly to Afghanistan? Because I think the major changes that we've seen in global relations go back to the summer of last year. And I said that it was very clear that the UK couldn't really stay in Afghanistan and lead our own foreign policy without the United States. But what became very clear to both Russia and to China was the weakness of NATO at that point, when essentially we leave Afghanistan and the Taliban simply walk back in. And so we've got a situation where China is very aware of the weakness of Western institutions, but the way it has chosen to engage globally has been different from that of Russia. And I don't think that's going to change. That there seems to be a preference in China to work through economic means, and that it might be different for Taiwan, but in terms of looking to have influence, so much of it has been about the loans that then lead into the acquisition of a port, for example. And so I'm not sure that Ukraine will necessarily mean direct lessons vis-a-vis China, but I think we need to be very aware that China poses a major threat in terms of the influence of Western values in the world. And since the middle of last year, it's become increasingly obvious that the sort of values that we thought we could simply export can't necessarily be exported as easily as we all assumed. And we have to work out, to an extent, a modus vivendi with China, which doesn't necessarily mean the sort of very close economic links that George Osborne wanted when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer. That we do need to impose sanctions on aspects of the Chinese economy where we believe slave labor has been used. So that clearly needs to be done. But at the same time, simply to try and sever ties with China entirely isn't really a credible strategy. And on some issues like climate change, we have certain things in common, even if they don't necessarily deliver quite on what they commit to.
Okay, thank you, Julie. And then Chris, I've credited David Chalmers with the question, by the way, so thank you for that, David.
Thank you, Louise. It's a long list, really, that we should be discussing, so let me try to be selective here. First, there are perhaps a few things that we should not be doing. We should not expose our economies and our intellectual infrastructure, i.e. our universities, to clear Chinese efforts to wheedle out the information China needs to compete with us. Universities are a soft spot for China in Europe, and we have allowed our universities financially to become too dependent on Chinese students and Chinese scientific cooperation. I don't believe we should ban such cooperation. I think there are still advantages for both sides, but we should be much more restrictive, including when it comes to the Confucius institutes, which are obviously the thin end of the wedge. Secondly, there are a few things that we should be doing. In terms of competing with China in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa, we need to invest in our soft power. We need to invest in cooperation based on a different model from the Chinese model. The Chinese model is one of extraction and of coercion, to put it slightly too strongly, but it's close to that. The way they attach conditions to their loans is one illustration. Our model should be different. We should work together on the basis of equality, on the basis of a willingness to take each other seriously as genuine partners, rather than in terms of a top-down relationship between European former colonial powers and the former colonies. What that means is we have to invest in cultural cooperation, in university cooperation, in economic cooperation, in all sorts of ways, so that these countries feel that we have a serious interest in them and not just a geopolitical interest to compete with China. To open a bracket, I very much regret that the United Kingdom has cut back its development spending, because the UK was one of the leading countries in terms of global development cooperation. And in terms of soft power, that's worth a lot. Very briefly, one third small point, an indirect point. China needs allies. At the moment, one of its allies is Russia. It's clear that the Chinese are backing up the Russians to the hilt. Well, what can we do? One thing we can do is make a success out of the democratic future of Ukraine, paradoxically. Because the more successful Ukraine becomes as a democracy and as a pro-Western country, the more that country will act as a magnet on reformers in Russia. Putin is afraid of one thing, and that is that in his own country, the reformers will gain the upper hand. And the reformers are now all looking at Ukraine. We need to stand by Ukraine. The stronger Ukraine becomes, the more Western and pro-European and successful it becomes, the more difficult it will be for the clique around Putin to maintain itself, and for the alliance between Russia and China to continue. 3 small suggestions out of a long, long list that we could discuss, I think, for a weekend.
I think Louise has just been muted.
Yeah.
There we are, thank you. I know it's something that lots of people would like to do very often.
It happens to all of us, I'm afraid. Sorry.
That's making what happens to me, Julie. Somebody makes me laugh and I cough. I totally understand that. Right. However, moving swiftly on, we do have another interesting question. Let me just get it up. Okay, so how do we? And I'm taking this both UK and the EU. How do we manage relationships with Turkey as a veto-wielding member of NATO? Vries, swap round. Chris, do you want to go first on this time?
You thought you'd lob me an easy one for a change. Pre-electoral phases are never conducive to long-term international cooperation. And it's clear that Mr. Erdogan is looking over his shoulder at his electorate, which is increasingly critical of his performance in office, particularly in the economic sphere, but also in terms of human rights and civil liberties. I'm not sure that we can make much progress with Mr. Erdogan in the next year or so. It's probably a matter of limiting the damage to the extent that we can. The Americans appear to be working behind the scenes to try and help Mr. Erdogan climb down from his needless confrontation of Sweden and Finland in the NATO enlargement discussion. Obviously, if Mr. Erdogan would have wanted, he could have opted for quiet diplomacy to get Sweden and Finland to do something about what he thinks is their lack of cooperation in the field of counterterrorism. I personally think that is way overblown, but he's decided to take the megaphone instead of the telephone, and that's for domestic political reasons. So let the Americans take care of that. I hope the UN makes some progress with the Turks, as they seem to be making now, on helping Ukraine export its grain to the rest of the world, where Turkey would also be a critical factor. And thirdly, again, soft power. We need to reach out to those people in Turkey who would like a different policy. The academics, many of whom have been fired, the journalists, many of whom are in jails, the trade union workers whose life has been made impossible, and so on and so on. And that means investing in instruments such as the British Council, or the Goethe Institute, or the Deutsche Welle, or the BBC World Service, to name just a few. Yep. Reaching out to help the opposition in Turkey is good policy, but I don't expect any results soon.
I'll assume I'm meant to come in at that point. I was in Turkey about 3 weeks ago at an academic conference talking about the future of Turkey and Europe. And at the end, I was talking to one of the people who'd been involved in the project at an earlier stage. And we were both slightly concerned that all the voices we'd been hearing were effectively the voices of the liberal opposition. And I think there is a slight danger that liberal politicians and academics end up hearing perhaps what we want to hear, because we were hearing some voices that seemed to be suggesting that Erdogan would be going quite soon. And I'm not sure that that is what's going to be happening in the short term. There have been some aspects of the response on Ukraine where Turkey actually seemed to be doing the right thing, but there is far too much of a sense of the president wanting to play the tough leader and that sort of autocratic leadership that we've begun to see in Hungary and obviously with Putin. So I think there is a real problem until we get a change of government in Turkey, that it's going to be difficult to get any major change. I think the issue of soft power that Gijs has raised is really important, and it's one where the government, I think, has been getting it systematically wrong. The cuts to the British Council have been very significant. And if you go elsewhere, there is the Goethe Institute, you've got the Cervantes Institutes. The British Council isn't supposed to be in any European Union countries, but it's not doing a huge amount in other places either. A lot of it's about teaching English as a foreign language, which is useful, but the UK isn't the only English language country, and it's not necessarily doing as much as it could be about culture and cultural values. But also, I think there is, again, some backlash because of the way the United Kingdom has walked away from those contractors who worked for the British Council in Afghanistan. So in places where the soft power would be in countries which have quite different values, if it then looks as if we're not supporting those people who have been working with the United Kingdom in terms of values, LGBTQ plus values, for example, that might put them at odds with the regime, if we then just walk away, that leaves a sense that in other countries, such as Turkey, people might say, well, why would we want to work for the British Council if we're not going to feel that we can be secure in what we're doing? And so I think the British government needs to be doing more in terms of expenditure on soft power, but also needs to be showing much more support, just as we should to interpreters and others. And I think there's a gap in what we've been doing that makes it quite difficult to do some of the things in countries like Turkey that maybe we ought to be doing.
Okay, thank you. Now I've got another question from Jeff Payne that I will put, and also Suzanne is asking there's David Grace, apparently there's a question in the chat that she's suggesting might like to be asked as a question, which I can't quite see at the moment. So I'm going to start on the question from Jeff Payne, and then if Gordon, who's moderating, can perhaps find the question that Suzanne's referring to. So the question to start us off then is, do you see India aligning with Russia and China as well? And how will that affect things for us in Europe? Julie, would you want to go first on this one?
But to an extent, yes, I think there is a danger, not necessarily of alignment, but of disagreeing with some of the values that we purport to be Western values. And I think the current government has too much of a tendency to think that somehow Commonwealth countries ought to agree with the United Kingdom. Yes, all the Commonwealth countries are supposed to be democracies, but they don't necessarily all look to the United Kingdom and think, wow, what a beacon of fundamental rights, human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. We should all aspire to be like the United Kingdom. And so I think there is a real issue about the extent to which India is interested in cooperating with the United Kingdom or with European countries. What we have to acknowledge in the 21st century is that the triumph of liberal values that we might all have hoped for after the end of the Cold War not only hasn't occurred in parts of Europe, but we've also got countries like India that say, well, we might be democratic, but it's according to our own rules and our own approach to things, and they're not necessarily simply going to come in line behind the UK and European values.
Okay, thank you, Grace.
No, that's unfortunately true. They're slightly bigger over there than we are, and that does make that does make the relationship a little bit asymmetrical at times. India, I think, is one of the great hopes of the world in terms of its democratic legacy and the freedom of the press that is still reasonably present. India, at the same time, is a huge disappointment in terms of the way the current government is heaving to the nationalist side of the Hindu vote, oppressing Muslims needlessly, provoking dissent and unhappiness throughout the country. Also, I think India is not helpful in terms of the fight against climate change, where India could be doing much more than it's willing to do. I don't think we have a golden solution here. We need to engage with India at all levels. And frankly, I think European countries, perhaps the UK excluding, have a tendency of being somewhat inward-looking at times. We don't think enough of what's going on in Asia, in India, in Southeast Asia. Indonesia is another country that is hardly ever referenced in serious international discussions on future relations in the world's biggest Muslim country. We do not have a clear European strategy with respect to a country like Indonesia. That's not answering the question about India, it's simply broadening the problem. We need to think more about that part of the world than we currently do.
Okay, Denali's just come in with a very cheeky supplementary that I'm going to ask for very quick answers on before I then go to David Grace, who's going to ask his own question. So what do you think about the fact that Boris Johnson seems to be all for strengthening in relations with India? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Or you've slightly touched on it, I think, Greece anyway, but what do we feel about that?
Well, it's good for him rhetorically because he can say this is something we could do because of Brexit. It isn't because of Brexit, but it's the sort of excuse that he'll make. No, we're looking at trade. Actually, 10 years ago, we could have had much closer relations with India if we'd liberalised our visa regime. So there are a whole set of things that could have been done as part of the European Union. But this is, I think, important for the Prime Minister to be seen to be delivering something because of Brexit. I'm not sure in the longer term how big a difference it's really going to make. But at the moment, it may help plug some of the skills gaps that we currently face in the UK post-Brexit.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And Greece, do you want to just add anything to that briefly? I think you touched on it. Okay, so the last word goes to another Cambridge man sitting down there on my screen. David, would you like to ask your question, please?
Thank you. We do talk a lot in Cambridge. As we've heard earlier, Boris Johnson, and he's repeated this many times, he says our primary focus is now the Indo-Pacific. Very undefined. I don't know what the countries in that part of the world, whether they think they're in it or not, what they think about it. I've been asking that the Liberal Democrats should develop an alternative perspective. And in particular, I've been asking our Federal Policy Committee for over a year now to have a security and defense review, because it's been a long time since we did a full one. And the world has changed. We've had Brexit, we've had Trump, we've had Putin. I did try looking at Boris's own integrated security view, possibly the worst defense document I've ever read. Not because I disagree with it. I mean, I disagree with a lot of these reviews. It's because it has almost no facts in it. It's just a statement of things he says he believes in, although he actually it's promises. So really, I want to see the party develop an alternative view and not just to have yet another debate on nuclear weapons. I've been through so many of them. Can we do that? Can we have a whole defense and security review, please?
So Federal Policy Committee appears, and I say this with some embarrassment because I am a member of the Federal Policy Committee, but since it's been online, my attendance hasn't been as good as it might have been. And somehow we seem to have agreed to have an international security working group, of which I have been made a member. It is being chaired by Christine Cheng. The first meeting is next week, but then the topics listed, which are in my inbox at the moment, include European defence and security and NATO, UK security outside of Europe, UK armed forces, international aid, economic inequality and global poverty, and so on and so forth. Is that the sort of start you were hoping for, David?
It sounds excellent, and it's not what they told me, so I'm pleased. And what is important is that well, first of all, I don't want to debate nukes on their own. Secondly, I don't want to debate defence on its own, because defence should be the servant of foreign policy. And I've been, as you have, well, one you chaired, I've been on a defence review where we weren't told what the foreign policy objectives were. You need both. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Right, so I'm now going to hand over to Ian Brodie-Brown, SLF Chair, who will be running the panel discussion. But first, I want to thank our speakers for excellent and very interesting contributions. Thank you very much indeed. It's great to see both of you, and who knows, hopefully in the autumn we might actually get to see you in person. Indeed. And thank you for all the very interesting questions. It is a sticky subject for Liberal Democrats, as David has just illustrated by his question to Julie. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. And I'm now going to hand over to Ian for the last session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, and thank you to the people from the previous session. This is the final wrap-up session I'm going to do, and I'm just waiting to be told who's going to be on my panel, because I don't quite know at present. Julie, I'm hoping, Gordon,